1.2. About 1840, a canal was constructed across the meadows of the Marsh Farm, connecting the newly opened collieries of the Erewash Valley. A high embankment traveled along the fields to carry the canal, which passed close to the homestead, and reaching the road went over in a heavy bridge. So the marsh was shut off from Ilkeston and enclosed in the small valley bed, which ended in a bushy hill and the village spire of Cossathay. The Brangwens received a fair sum of money from this trespass across their land. Then a short time afterwards a colliery was sunk on the other side of the canal, and in a while the Midland Railway came down the valley at the foot of the Ilkeston Hill, and the invasion was complete. The town grew rapidly. The Brangwens were kept busy producing supplies. They became richer. They were almost tradesmen. Still, the marsh remained remote and original, on the old quiet side of the canal embankment, in the sunny valley, where slow water wound along in company of stiff alders, and the road went under ash trees past the Brangwens' garden state. But looking from the garden state down the road to the right there, through the dark archway of the canal square aqueduct, was a colliery spinning away in the near distance, and further, red, crude houses plastered on the valley in masses, and beyond all, the dim smoking hill of the town. The homestead was just on the safe side of civilization, outside the gate. The house stood bare from the road, approached by a straight garden path, along which at spring the daffodils were thick and green and yellow. At the sides of the house were bushes of lilac, and guelder rose, and privet, entirely hiding the farm buildings behind. At the back a confusion of sheds spread into the home close from out of 2 or 3 indistinct yards. The duck pond lay beyond the furthest wall, littering its white feathers on the padded earthen banks, blowing its stray soiled feathers into the grass, and the gorse bushes below the canal embankment, which rose like a high rampart near at hand, so that occasionally a man's figure passed in silhouette, or a man and a towering horse traversed the sky. At first the Brangwens were astonished by all this commotion around them. The building of the canal across their land made them strangers in their own place. This raw bank of earth shutting them off, disconcerted them. As they worked in the fields, from beyond the new familiar embankment came the rhythmic run of the winding engines, startling at first, but afterwards a narcotic to the brain. Then the shrill whistle of the trains re-echoed through the heart with fearsome pleasure, announcing the far-off come near and imminent. As they drove home from town, the farmers of the land met the blackened colliers trooping from the pit mouth. As they gathered the harvest, the west wind brought a faint sulphurous smell of pit refuse burning. As they pulled the turnips in November, the sharp clink, 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 clink of empty trucks shunting on the line vibrated in their hearts with the fact of other activity going on beyond them. The Alfred Brangwen of this period had married a woman from Heanor, daughter of the Black Horse. She was a slim, pretty dark woman, quaint in her speech, whimsical so that the sharp things she said did not hurt. She was oddly a thing to herself, rather querulous in her manner, but intrinsically separate and indifferent, so that her long, lamentable complaints, when she raised her voice against her husband in particular, and against everybody else after him, only made those who heard her wonder and feel affectionately towards her, even whilst they were irritated and impatient with her. She railed long and loud about her husband, but always with a balanced, easy flying voice and a quaint manner of speech that warmed his belly with pride and male triumph, whilst he scowled with mortification at the things she said. Consequently, Brangwyn's Brangwyn himself had a humorous puckering at the eyes, a sort of fat laugh, very quiet and full, and he was spoilt like a lord of creation. He calmly did as he liked, laughed at her railing, accused him in a teasing tone that she loved, followed his natural inclinations, and sometimes pricked to her the quick, frightened and broke her by a deep, tense fury which seemed to fix on him and hold him for days, and which she would give anything to placate in him. They were two very separate beings, vitally connected, knowing nothing of each other, yet living in their separate ways from one root. There were 4 sons and 2 daughters. The eldest boy ran away early to sea, and did not come back. After this, the mother was more the node and center of attraction in the home. The second boy, Alfred, whom the mother admired most, was the most reserved. He was sent to school in Ilkeston and made some progress, but in spite of his dogged, yearning effort, he could not get beyond the rudiments of anything save of drawing. At this, in which he had some power, he worked as if it were his hope. After much grumbling and savage rebellion against everything, after much trying and shifting about, when his father was licensed against him, and his mother almost despairing, he became a draughtsman in the lace factory in Nottingham. He remained heavy and somewhat uncouth, speaking with broad Derbyshire accent, adhering with all his tenacity to his work and to his town position, making good designs and becoming fairly well off. But at drawing his hand swung naturally in big bold lines, rather lax, so that it was cruel for him to pedgill away at the lace designing, working from the tiny squares of his paper, counting and plotting and niggling. He did it stubbornly with anguish, crushing the bowels within him, adhering to the chosen lot, whatever it should cost. And he came back into life, set the right, a rare spoken, almost surely man. He married the daughter of a chemist, who affected some social superiority, and he became something of a snob in his social superiority, and he became something of a snob in his dogged fashion, with a passion for outward refinement in the household, mad when anything clumsy or gross occurred. Later, when his 3 children were growing up, and he seemed a staid, almost middle-aged man, he turned after strange women and became a silent, inscrutable follower of forbidden pleasure, neglecting his indignant bourgeois wife without a qualm. Frank, the third son, refused from the first to have anything to do with learning. From the first he hung around the slaughterhouse, which stood away in the 3rd yard at the back of the farm. The Brangwens had always killed their own meat, and supplied the neighborhood. Out of this grew a regular butcher's business in connection with the farm. As a child, Frank had been drawn by the trickle of dark blood that ran across the pavement from the slaughterhouse to the crew yard, by the sight of the man carrying across to the meat shed a huge side of beef, with the kidneys showing, embedded in their heavy laps of fat. He was a handsome lad, with soft brown hair and irregular features, something like a later Roman youth. He was more easily excitable, more readily carried away than the rest, weaker in character. At 18 he married a little factory girl, a pale, plump, quiet thing with sly eyes and a wheedling voice, who insinuated herself into him and bore him a child every year and made a fool of him. When he had taken over the butchery business, already a growing callousness to it, and a sort of contempt, made him neglectful of it. He drank, and was often to be found in the public house, blathering away as if he knew everything, when in reality he was a noisy fool. Of the daughters, Alice the elder married a collier, and lived for a time stormily in Ilkeston, before moving away to Yorkshire with her numerous young family. Effie the younger remained at home. The last child, Tom, was considerably younger than his brothers, so had belonged rather to the company of his sisters. He was his mother's favourite. She roused herself to determination and sent him forcibly away to grammar school in Derby when he was 12 years old. He did not want to go, and his father would have given way, but Mrs. Brangwen had set her heart on it. Her slender, pretty, tightly covered body, with full skirts, was now the centre of resolution in the house, and when she had once set upon anything, which was not often, the family failed before her. So Tom went to school, an unwilling failure from the first. He believed his mother was right in decreeing school for him, but he knew she was only right because she would not acknowledge his constitution. He knew, with a child's deep instinctive foreknowledge of what is going to happen to him, and he would cut a sorry figure at school. But he took the infliction as inevitable, as if he were guilty of his own nature, as if his being were wrong and his mother's conception right. If he could have been what he liked, he would have been that which his mother fondly had deludedly hoped he was. He would have been clever and capable of becoming a gentleman. It was her aspiration for him, therefore, he knew, it was the true aspiration for any boy. But you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, as he told his mother very clearly. With regard to himself, much of her mortification it was her aspiration for him, therefore he knew it was the true aspiration for any boy. But you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, as he told his mother very early, with regard to himself, much to her mortification and chagrin. When he got to school, he made a violent struggle against his physical inability to study. He sat gripped, making himself pale and ghastly in his effort to concentrate on the book, to take in what he had to learn. But it was no good. If he beat down his first repulsion and got like a suicide to the stuff, he went very little further. He could not learn deliberately. His mind simply did not work. In feeling, he was developed, sensitive to the atmosphere around him, brutal perhaps, but at the same time delicate, very delicate. So he had a low opinion of himself. He knew his own limitation. He knew that his brain was a slow, hopeless good-for-nothing. So he was humble. But at the same time his feelings were more discriminating than those of most of the boys, and he was confused. He was more sensuously developed, more refined in instinct than they. For their mechanical stupidity he hated them and suffered cruel contempt for them. But when it came to mental things, then he was at a disadvantage. He was at their mercy. He was a fool. He had not the power to controvert even the most stupid argument, so that he was forced to admit things he did not in the least believe. And having admitting them, he did not know whether he believed them or not. He rather thought he did. But he loved anyone who could convey enlightenment to him through feeling. He sat betrayed with emotion when the teacher of literature read in a moving fashion Tennyson's Ulysses, or Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. His lips parted, his eyes filled with a strained, almost suffering light. And the teacher read on, fired by his power over the boy. Tom Brangwyn was moved by this experience beyond all calculation. He almost dreaded it. It was so deep. But when, almost secretly and shamefully, he came to take the book himself, and began the words, O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, the very fact of the print caused a prickly sensation of repulsion to go over his skin. The blood came to his face. His heart filled with a bursting passion of rage and incompetence. He threw the book down and walked over it and went out to the cricket field. And he hated books as if they were his enemies. He hated them worse than ever he hated any person. He could not voluntarily control his attention. His mind had no fixed habits to go by. He had nothing to get hold of, nowhere to start from. For him there was nothing palpable, nothing knowing in himself, that he could apply to learning. He did not know how to begin. Therefore he was helpless when it came to deliberate understanding or deliberate learning. He had an instinct for mathematics, but if this failed him, he was helpless as an idiot. So that he felt that the ground was never sure under his feet. He was nowhere. His final downfall was his complete inability to attend to a question put without suggestion. If he had to write a formal composition on the army, he did at last learn to repeat the few facts he knew. You can join the army at 18. You have to be over 5'8". But he had all the time a living conviction that this was a dodge, and that his commonplaces were beneath contempt. Then he reddened furiously, felt his bowels sink with shame, scratched out what he had written, made an agonized effort to think of something in the real composition style, failed, became sullen with rage and humiliation, put the pen down, and would have been torn to pieces rather than attempt to write another word. He soon got used to the grammar school, and the grammar school got used to him, setting him down as a hopeless duffer at learning, but respecting him for a generous, honest nature. Only one narrow, domineering fellow, the Latin master, bullied him and made the blue eyes mad with shame and rage. There was a horrid scene when the boy laid open the master's head with a slate, and then things went on as before. The teacher got little sympathy, but Brangwyn winced and could not bear to think of the deed, not even long after, when he was a grown man. He was glad to leave school. It had not been unpleasant. He had enjoyed the companionship of the other youths, or had thought he enjoyed it. The time had passed very quickly in endless activity, but he knew all the time that he was in an ignominious But he knew all the time that he was in an ignominious position in the place of learning. He was aware of failure all the while, of incapacity. But he was too healthy and sanguine to be wretched. He was too much alive. Yet his soul was wretched almost to hopelessness. He had loved one warm, clever boy who was frail in body, a consumptive type. The two had an almost classic friendship, David and Jonathan, wherein Brangwyn was the Jonathan, the server. But he had never felt equal with his friend, because the other's mind outpaced his and left him ashamed far in the rear. So the two boys went at once apart on leaving school, but Brangwyn always remembered his friend and had been kept him as a sort of light, a fine experience to remember. Tom Brangwyn was glad to get back to the farm, where he was in his own again. "I have got a turnip on my shoulders. Let me stick to the fallow," he said to his exasperated mother. He had too low an opinion of himself, but he went about at his work on the farm gladly enough, glad of the active labor and the smell of the land again, having youth and vigor and humor and a comic wit, having the will and the power to forget his own shortcomings, finding himself violent and occasionally rageous, but usually on good terms with everybody and everything. When he was 17, his father fell from a stack and broke his neck. Then the mother and son and daughter lived on the farm, interrupted by occasional loud-mouthed lamenting, jealous-spirited visitations from the butcher Frank, who had a grievance against the world, which he felt was always giving him less than his dues. Frank was particularly against the young Tom, whom he called a Mardy baby, and Tom returned the hatred violently, his face growing red and his blue eyes staring. Effie sided with Tom against Frank. But when Alfred came from Nottingham, heavy-jowled and lowering, speaking very little, but treating those at home with some contempt, Effie and the mother sided with him and put Tom into the shade. It irritated the youth that his elder brother should be made something of a hero by the women just because he didn't live at home and was a lace designer and almost a gentleman. But Alfred was something of a Prometheus bound, so the women loved him. Tom came later to understand his brother better. As youngest son, Tom felt some importance when the care of the farm developed on to him. He was only 18, but he was quite capable of doing everything his father had done. And of course his mother remained as centre to the house. The young man grew up very fresh and alert, with zest for every moment of his life. He worked the road and drove to market. He went out with companions and got tipsy occasionally and played skittles and went to the little travelling theatres. Once, when he was drunk at a public house, he was upstairs with a prostitute who seduced him. He was then 19. The thing was something of a shock to him. In the close intimacy of the farm kitchen, the woman occupied the supreme position. The men deferred to her in the house on all household points, on all points of morality and behavior. The woman was the symbol for that further life which comprised religion and love and morality. The men placed in her hands their own conscience. They said to her, "Be my conscience keeper. Be the angel at the doorway guarding my outgoing and my incoming." And the woman fulfilled her trust. The men rested implicitly in her, receiving her praise or her blame with pleasure or with anger, rebelling and storming, but never for a moment really escaping in their own souls from the prerogative. They depended on her for her stability. Without her, they would have felt like straws in the wind, to be blown hither and thither at random. She was the anchor and the security. She was the restraining hand of God, at times highly to be execrated. Now, when Tom Brannigan, at 19, a youth fresh like a plant rooted in his mother and sister, found that he had lain with a prostitute woman in a common public house, he was very much startled. For him there was until that time only one kind of woman, his mother and sister. But now he did not know what to feel. There was a slight wonder, a pang of anger, of disappointment, a first taste of ash, and of cold fear, lest this was all that would happen, lest his relations with women were going to be no more than the nothingness. There was a slight sense of shame before the prostitute, fear that she would despise him for his inefficiency. There was a cold distaste for her, and a fear of her. There was a moment of paralyzed horror, when he felt he might have taken a disease from her, and upon all this startled tumult of emotion was laid the steadying hand of common sense, which said it did not matter very much, so long as he had no disease. He soon recovered balance, and really it did not matter so very much. But it had shocked him, and put a mistrust into his heart, and emphasized his fear of what was within himself. He was, however, in a few days going about again in his own careless, happy-go-lucky fashion, his blue eyes just as clear and honest as ever, his face just as fresh, his appetite just as keen. Or apparently so. He had, in fact, lost some of his buoyant confidence, and doubt hindered his outgoing. For some time after this he was quieter, more conscious when he drank, more backward from companionship. The dissolution of his first carnal contact with women, strengthened by his innate desire to find in a woman the embodiment of all his inarticulate, powerful religious impulses, put a bit in his mouth. He had something to lose which he was afraid of losing, which he was not sure even of possessing. This first affair did not matter much, but the business of love was at the bottom of his soul, the most serious and terrifying of all to him.